Good afternoon, everyone. So let me tell how we are going to proceed. So first, I will tell you a little bit about ASTA and then about the ASTA legislations. So ASTA is a professional organization for scientists and engineers who are striving to advance aerosol research in Indian context. The association provides a platform for exchanging knowledge, resources, and information among researchers, member organization, industrial counterparts, and related disciplines by organizing conferences, technical meetings, lectures, and publications. ASTA addresses various interests such as environmental science, air pollution, indoor and outdoor air quality, occupational safety and public health, industrial and medical applications, and nuclear safety, etc. ASTA is a member of International Aerosol Research Assembly and also a member of Asian Aerosol Research Association. Last year, we started this monthly lecture series, and today is the anniversary of our lecture series. And in this lecture series, every month we organize an online lecture, which goes about 45 to 50 minutes by eminent researchers working in various fields of aerosol research in science or engineering or medicine or industry. The lectures are followed by interactive question and answer session, where one can directly interact with the speaker. Today's speaker is Dr. Claudia Mohr. Now let me briefly introduce her. So Professor Claudia Mohr is a renowned atmospheric scientist interested in the characterization of chemical composition of aerosol particles and trace gases by means of advanced mass spectrometric techniques and the investigation of their sources, formation and transformation process and fate in the atmosphere in the field and laboratory measurements. She did her undergrad with internship at PSI, Switzerland, followed by master's from University of Colorado and PhD from PSI. She was a postdoc at University of Washington. Subsequently, she joined Stockholm University as an assistant professor. Since February 2023, she is a professor of aerosol chemistry at ETH Zurich, Switzerland, and she is leading the Laboratory of Atmospheric Chemistry, which is called LAC at PSI in Switzerland. The LAC research focuses on the impact anthropogenic activities on fundamental processes in the atmosphere, and with that, on air quality, human health, and on climate. A strong focus also lies on the link between energy generation and use and its impact on the environment. She has an H index of 50 and more than 10,000 citations. Today, she'll be talking about aerosol-cloud interaction. What can we learn from chemical composition measurements? With these few words, I invite Dr. Claudia to please start her talk. Dr. Claudia, please share your presentation.
Is that okay in full screen?
Yes, we can see and it is in full screen.
Wonderful. Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to give this lecture. It has been a bit a tricky process to finally manage for me to be here and talk, and I'm very honored to give this lecture to you today, and good afternoon to everyone listening. And thanks a lot for the kind introduction. So I assume that some of you have actually collaborated with our laboratory, with the Laboratory of Atmospheric Chemistry at PSI, quite closely. We have quite a lot of projects in our lab in collaboration with different Indian institutes and agencies that focus a lot on air quality, on the source apportionment of atmospheric aerosols, understanding the sources and the links to air pollution mitigation. So I'm very happy to talk to you today about a little bit a different aspect of this research that we do, or that I have been doing, but I will also always link it a little bit to the aspect of air quality, because I think it's a topic of very high importance, and linking the aerosol cloud interactions with the air quality also shows a bit what a central role aerosol particles take in different challenges that we are facing as a society, be it climate change or air pollution. So with that, I will now dive into my talk, which is, as already mentioned, the question. So when we do chemical composition measurements of aerosols, which is really the focus of my work and our lab, what can we learn about this very, very complex topic of aerosol cloud interactions. But before I get started, I would like to show you this by now very famous figure from the latest IPCC that shows the contributions of different atmospheric constituents, gases, and also particulate components to radiative forcing. So their contribution to the change in watts per meter squared that we are observing and the resulting change in the global temperature and the average global temperature. So on the left-hand side, you see the effect of different compounds on effective radiative forcing in watts per meter squared. And on the right-hand side, you see the same, but then transferred to temperature. And of course, we all know CO2 has a big warming effect, a positive effect on the watts per meter squared, and an increase on average of about 1.5 degrees. What I want you to focus on then is on the pink, on the purple stuff, the aerosols. So we have the bars of aerosol components. We have SO2, so sulfate aerosols. We have organic carbon, organic aerosols, black carbon, so soot particles, and then ammonia. And then the bars are divided into direct interactions of aerosols with radiation, and then also the aerosol cloud interaction, so the indirect effect. And nothing new, but what we all know is that aerosols on average have a cooling effect on the overall climate. So both through the direct and the indirect effect. This is very prominent for SO2, so the sulfate part, but then also for the organic fraction. What we also keep seeing and discussing in our community are the large error bars, those uncertainties that we have when it comes to quantifying this contribution of the aerosols to the global change, to the change in the temperature that we are observing. And obviously, given that the aerosols are this important negative contributor, it is very important that we start to be more quantitative there, that we can really say what is the contribution of the cooling effect of the aerosols that we observe in comparison to the warming effect of mostly the greenhouse gases. And there's different problems to quantifying this in a better way, to bringing these error bars down. And one aspect is for sure a process understanding. So understanding the different processes, quantifying them, how aerosols influence cloud formation. And then it is also how those processes are represented in the global models. So I will not talk about this too much, but I think it is a very important aspect of our work, especially for people like us, our lab, who works at the process scale, who tries to understand the processes of aerosol formation, of aerosol interactions with water vapor in the atmosphere, of cloud formation, that we then also translate this understanding at a very detailed scale into the global models appropriately. And this is still something where I think we as a community have a long way to go. So the questions that I'm asking myself a bit, not just for this talk, but in general, is really like, in order to understand better the impact of aerosols on the climate via direct interactions with radiation or clouds, is how well do we need to understand aerosols? How well do we need to understand clouds? To what detail do we need to go to be able to then go to the global scale and say, now we can really quantify these contributions? And I don't think I will give you an answer today, but I want to show you a few snapshots of the research that we do in order to especially understand the chemistry of the aerosols better. And I hope that with communication also to people who work on the largest scale, who work on the modeling aspect, that we together as a community can continue to improve our understanding and the quantification of climate change. So just a quick step back, very basic. When we are talking about the interactions of aerosols and clouds and their influence, so how are clouds formed at all? So on the left-hand side, you have a very simple schematic. You have an updraft, basically, and then you have the formation of a cloud. So we start from aerosols, dry aerosols that act as potential cloud nucleation condensation particles. So they're being uplifted. They take up water. So below supersaturation, they take up water. They grow hygroscopistically. And then once they reach a certain supersaturation, they start to be activated and they grow to cloud droplets. And this part, this activation part, is described by the Köhler theory. I'm not going much into detail, but like what I want to focus on, or where I want you to take away from this, is really that we need both, or like actually one can say we need three aspects, right? We need the aerosol that can act as the nucleus for the cloud droplets to form. We need this updraft to reach supersaturations, and we need the water around to really be able to activate aerosols as cloud droplets. And again, like one aspect is also the property of the aerosol that determines whether then a particle can be activated as a cloud droplet or not. So this is a bit a similar schematic, but just from a real picture. And I think it shows really nicely, like it's one of these rare occasions where you get to take a picture that shows a bit what you want to talk about or investigate. So this is a picture that is from a campaign that we had in South America, in Bolivia, in the Andes. And we could observe this fire that was going on in the plane, and then the emissions, the smoke, the water going up and forming this cloud right above the fire. So it's both like bringing up the cloud condensation nucleus, but also like the water vapor that led probably to the formation of this cloud. So this is just like a real picture of the schematic that I showed you before. So I've mentioned it a little bit, but I want to take it up again here. So when we are investigating aerosol cloud interactions, it is really challenging because we have to bridge scales. So we go from the left-hand side when we talk about the investigation of particle properties, the formation of particles. Some of them are emitted directly, some of them are emitted as precursor gases that get oxidized in the atmosphere, form new particles. So we are talking about individual gases and then clusters of molecules at the nanometer scale. When we move to particles, we are in the nanometer, micrometer range, depending on what the sources are, the properties. We start to grow the particle through uptake of water, this hygroscopic growth that I mentioned before, and eventually the particles get activated here as a cloud droplet and grow a bit further in also the several tens of micrometer range. But then from there, when we want to understand whole system, we need also the dynamics, and we're talking about scales that span kilometers or even like the half of the globe. So this also, I think, what I said before, makes it so tricky to really come up with the quantification of aerosol cloud interactions, because we cross so many scales. We need to include so many different techniques and so many different approaches that it makes it not impossible, but very challenging to come to quantitative aspects. And I have mentioned that in the beginning also a little bit, that like there is this very important interaction also with air pollution. So we said before, right, aerosols have a cooling effect on the climate. Aerosols are part or a very dominant part of air pollution that we emit as humans that are bad for our health. So we are trying everything to get to lower the concentrations of anthropogenically emitted particles and gases. But that, of course, will also influence the particle population that we have in the atmosphere. That will also influence then the interactions with the water vapor and the cloud formation. And that, so I think also as we now move into a future where climate change is already ongoing, but we also have efforts to mitigate air pollution, we will really change again the composition of the atmosphere. And together as a community, we will need to work on understanding what this means for the composition of the atmosphere and then also for the impacts on the big climate system. So what I will be talking about in the next few minutes is focusing on the small scale. So I'm not a climate modeler. I look at the small scale. So I will show you a little bit our efforts to understand the chemical composition of the particles better, but also of the particles that activate as cloud droplets, to really try to shed a bit of light. What are the particles that are very efficient in forming cloud droplets? What happens then if we get rid of those particles, if their emissions increase? So this is our piece of the puzzle that we want to contribute, the chemical composition of the particles and what that means when it comes to them acting as nuclei for cloud droplets. So I will start already now with the take-home messages, just that I have given you the most important messages that I would like you to take away from this talk, and then I will actually describe them a little bit more. So overall, when it comes to aerosol chemical composition, we have made very large advances in their characterization. I think it's been a long process over decades with filter measurements, detailed chemical analysis, that together with then the development of online methods, especially mass spectrometry, have really helped us to dig deep into the composition and the formation processes of the aerosols down to the really molecular level. And this also has, of course, helped to improve our understanding of how these compounds then interact with water vapor, what this does to the cloud formation process at the droplet scale. And I would argue that this detailed process level knowledge on aerosol cloud interactions is one of the basics that we need for well-informed decisions on what we put in what way into the regional and global models. So only if we have a very fundamental and good knowledge of the individual processes, then we can simplify them in a good way, in an accurate way, so that we can put them into regional and global models. And still, we need more in situ observations, long-term observations, and also experiments, but they should be largely guided by the gaps in the models of all scales, so that we can investigate the exact process needed to then improve the models and explain the gaps that we want to explain. Okay, a word on the mass spectrometric technique. So I have said that we have really made large advances in aerosol mass spectrometry and understanding in real time the aerosol composition, really the composition of either individual aerosol particles or the bulk. And one method that I use a lot in my research is chemical ionization mass spectrometry. So you ionize, you somehow get the particles, or if you're interested in the gas phase, you get them into the gas phase, you desorb the particles, you ionize the molecules with chemical ionization, and that is usually a soft ionization method, so the molecules stay largely intact, you don't fragment so much, and then you get the mass spectrum that shown here is like each individual stick is one compound that you could really get the molecular composition of each individual compound, you can get the molecular composition. One downside is that we don't know the structure of the molecules with mass spectrometry. We know the atomic composition. With the technique that I'm using, we can then also investigate the volatility of compounds. And the volatility is, of course, a fundamental concept if we think about the distribution of a compound between the phases, between the gas phase and the condensed phase, be it the particle phase or the droplet phase of cloud droplets. So we can parameterize the volatility using molecular composition measurements. So that's here in the middle. We can then distribute, we can take the molecular composition, we can calculate the saturation vapor pressure, and then bin the different compounds with their different vapor pressures into decadal bins, and thus get the distribution of the volatility of our aerosol, of our bulk aerosol. We can see how big the mass fraction is in each volatility bin. We can also, due to the fact that with the technique we desorb the aerosol particles, we can also, through the desorption, we can understand a bit of their volatility. This is also maybe a bit less quantitative, but what you can see here is the desorption temperature at which a compound desorbs. So basically, if we have compounds with high carbon numbers and high oxygen numbers. So those are the ones that would be more complex, heavier molecules. They dissolve at higher temperatures. That's something that has a low carbon number and maybe a bit a lower oxygen to carbon ratio. So like with the technique, this chemical ionization mass spectrometer that we are using with this particular inlet shown here, we can really get a bit of a handle on both the molecular composition of individual compounds and also on their volatility, which allows us to understand better if we predominantly will find them in the gas phase or in the particle phase, or maybe even dissolved in a cloud droplet. We have used this technique by now in many different places across the planet. So you can see here like measurements from South America, the US, across Europe, up in the Arctic, and then also in China and in India. So we have really been in many different environments with this technique. I have put here below a map with the basically the effects, the death of air pollution. So what is a bit light blue is a bit cleaner air, and when it gets orange and red is a bit more polluted air. So what you can see is that with our instrument, we have really covered regions that were like very clean or a bit more clean to a bit more polluted. And just to show you a bit what we have found with this technique when it comes to aerosol composition. So this is a bit independent of the cloud measurements that I will show you right after. So what we could find here for the different stations, this is now a compilation for many different stations. You see here the organic fraction separated into compounds which have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and those which also have nitrogen, and then others. So this is often sulfur-containing compounds. Then we have divided the stations into mountain, rural, and urban stations. And as expected a bit, but now we can really show with our data, is that if you are in urban locations, you have a higher contribution from nitrogen-containing organics due to the NOx emissions. You have in rural stations higher contributions of compounds that just have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And then we also have some more mountainous stations where we have influence from sulfur-containing compounds, also through volcanic emissions that are in the free troposphere. So this really gives us an overall fairly good understanding of the molecular composition of the aerosols in different regions. And this is then even a bit more detailed. So what we show here is the average carbon number of the compounds that we measure, and here the average oxygen number of the compounds that we measure. You see overall they fall in some kind of relationship. So if you start with a fairly large molecule, like with a big carbon backbone, it has also like the potential oxygen to carbon ratio is quite high also. But then you also have like places like this is the measurements from Delhi, where we see we have quite like kind of a highish carbon number, but then not such a high oxidation state. So this shows that when we were measuring in Delhi, for example, we were quite influenced by maybe more primary emissions, biomass burning emissions, with a bit less of like further oxidation going on. So this is what we can do with our technique. And now for us, the next step is to take this technique, this very detailed chemical knowledge that we can get with this instrument of the aerosol composition, and use this also for the particles that were activated as clouds, or even for the cloud droplets and the cloud water. And I will show you a few examples of this now. So this is again a bit like a schematic of what we do. So we have this technique that allows us in situ in real time to look at the molecular composition of particles. Now, when we are in the atmosphere out somewhere in the field and in a place where we are even impacted by clouds or fog, so say maybe a bit higher up on a mountaintop or at like lower levels, but where there is fog formation, then the distribution is somewhere like this, right? We have a mix of aerosol particles, of course, also gases, and then cloud droplets, cloud particles. What we then do is we add before our mass spectrometer a counterflow virtual impactor, which essentially through different flows that interact with each other gets rid of the smaller particles. And that means all that enters our inlet and our mass spectrometer are the activated particles, the cloud particles. We then evaporate the water, and what we're left with is the residual, the cloud residual. So the particle that used to be activated as a cloud droplet, now dried, and we call that cloud residual or fog residual. Of course, we can also have contributions here in this residual of gases that partitioned into the cloud droplet. Maybe were not part of the initial cloud condensation nucleus. I will talk a little bit about that as well. And then we can analyze that again with our mass spectrometer. So this is an online process. We're really sitting in the field and we can directly look at the compound, at the particles that were activated as clouds. This then looks a little bit like that. That is a paper that I will discuss with you right now. So we have here the cloud. We have this counterflow virtual impactor inlet that only lets through the cloud residuals. And then we also have a whole air inlet that would allow through the total particles and the cloud residuals and the aerosol particles that would not be activated as clouds. And depending on what conditions we would be interested in, we would then switch between those two. So if there is a cloud, we would measure from this side. If it's cloud-free conditions, we would measure from this side, switch with the valve, measure always the size distribution with differential mobility particle sizing measurements, and then analyze either the particles or the cloud residuals with our mass spectrometer with the Figaro SIMS. We did this in 2 locations that I have shown you so far, and we plan to do it further, but these were really the first deployments of this technique. So one was in a pristine environment in the Arctic on Svalbard, and then one was in a polluted environment in the Italian Po Valley. And I will show you a little bit what we have found there. So the measurement sites we chose are important for different reasons. So in the Arctic, we know that we see a warming of the atmosphere that is above average. So the Arctic is warming more than the rest of the globe. And there are many different factors playing into this enhanced warming, this Arctic amplification. One of them is also the role of low-level clouds, which we still don't know so well. So those low-level clouds, are they more of those, less of those? How transparent are they? What are their optical properties? So this is one aspect that we were very interested in. And then, of course, that ties to the aerosols acting as cloud condensation nuclei. When we talk about the polluted Po Valley in Italy, it was a very different research question. What we want to understand there, because this region is very polluted, especially in winter. At the same time, there's high relative humidity that leads to these fog episodes. So what we wanted to understand is how does the pollution, the particles influence the fog formation, and also how does the fog influence the particle population, both in terms of concentration levels, but also in terms of the chemical properties and eventually the health effects. And also in both cases, we have this interaction that I mentioned earlier between climate change and air pollution. So the Arctic, of course, undergoes this enhanced warming, but some of the aerosols that may act as cloud condensation nuclei also come from lower latitudes that are more polluted. When we talk about the Italian Po Valley, we see that the fog pattern is also changing a bit through climate change and maybe air pollution. At the same time, also air pollution is getting lower, or that's the hope because of mitigation effects. So again, it is these interactions between anthropogenic emissions, anthropogenic climate change, and then the composition of the atmosphere that we are very interested in. So when we went to the Arctic, we measured on Svalbard. There is this Zeppelin observatory. So Svalbard is this little group of islands here. When you go further north of Norway, somewhere you hit the islands of Ny-Ålesund, of Svalbard with Ny-Ålesund, and there is a long-term station there on a little mountain of 480 meters above sea level, the Zeppelin Observatory. This is the view down to the little village. And then we could bring up our stuff with this little cable car that goes up and down. And this Zeppelin Observatory is often impacted by clouds through its a bit elevated altitude. So this was a very good spot to try to understand a bit more about the aerosols and the clouds in this region. So looking a little bit at measurements in general from the Arctic, what we know already from also AMS measurements, aerosol mass spectrometer measurements, that we have, when we look at PM1, excluding the larger particles, which also have a fairly big contribution of sea salt, we have the organic fraction and then also quite a dominant sulfate fraction, not least through emissions of MSA and then DMS formation and so on. Or the DMS emissions and the MSA formation. When we then look at different stations, and there is also sea salt included, we see quite a similar picture. So we have this influence of organics, of sulfate, and to some extent also sea salt in the larger particles. So those are really like the dominating aerosol components in the Arctic. And we are now interested in, with our technique, if we can add more details to the organic fraction, because we have a method that can look at individual organic compounds and then also how the particles in the clouds look like. So what we did here is our measurements from the aerosol fraction, so not looking at clouds yet. So we see here the data from our instrument, the organics, the signal. We see here the carbon number of compounds, and the colors are the oxygen numbers, because now we can really look at individual molecules. What we see is that we have a fair distribution, quite a high distribution of different compounds that can have up to 20 carbon atoms. The most of the signal is somewhere of compounds between like 5 and maybe 15 carbon atoms, and they have oxygen numbers of maybe 3 to 4. So that gives us already an indication that we might see like carboxylic acid as an important contributor to our aerosol, for example, but also that we really have this wide distribution of molecules with different properties that influence then overall how the aerosols would interact with the cloud droplets. So now we totally switch now to the cloud residuals. So we were measuring there for 1 year. For 1 year, we tried to catch every cloud event that we could, switch our inlets so that we would measure just the composition of the cloud residuals. And this is what you can see here. So we have here the different cloud events. So December, May, June, September, October, December. So you see a lot of cloud events are in the summer also. And you see here the measured contributions. So here in relative, maybe we can focus on this in relative of different species of interest that we measured. What you can see here again is that we have this high contribution of organic compounds with carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But then, interestingly, we also see in the summer months, in the cloud residuals, this high contribution of methane sulfonic acid, so the sulfur-containing species that it is related to DMS emissions from the sea. And we have known already that measuring the ambient particle population, that in summer, those emissions from the marine biosphere, that they increase through the active biological processes. But now we could show for the first time that they actually also directly end up in the clouds. So what those measurements, these yearly measurements show is that we have a local formation of aerosol particles through emissions from the marine biosphere, and that those particles that are really of local sources also end up in the clouds and thus have the potential to influence the cloud properties. So this was really an interesting finding for us. We then also looked at just one specific cloud event to understand a bit if we see a difference in the properties of the cloud residuals before the cloud hits, during the cloud, and then after the cloud event. We also looked at where the air masses are coming from. So you see here that the trajectories that they traveled a bit over land here, but then also a lot over the sea before impacting the station. But what you can see is that during the time period that we analyzed the cloud, there was not a big change of air masses. So we still have the same air masses more or less, but we have a cloud formed and then dissipating again. What you can see here is the size distribution before, during the cloud, in the cloud residuals, and then also after the cloud. And this again shows now also the effect of size on the uptake of aerosols by cloud. So what just I ask you to focus on this blue line, that is the cloud residual. So the particles that were taken up or acted as cloud condensation nuclei. And these are predominantly found in the larger mode. So again, it is mostly, at least for this event in May, the rather larger particles of the aerosol population around that are being taken up by clouds. And this is, of course, important to understand also. I mean, it is possible that we have a different composition of the particles, whether they are, say, in the Aitken mode or in the accumulation mode. So what is being taken up by a cloud is more the larger particles. We then also looked at the chemical composition, and this is now really interesting. So we compared the chemical composition with our technique before, during, and after the cloud event. And like without going much in detail, but what you can see is that there is actually not such a big change in this environment. So we have in the cloud residuals maybe like very similar composition to before we had the cloud, before particles got activated. After, we may have slightly more organics. But overall, also, if you look at the very detailed composition, again, carbon number of oxygen atoms, we see that the composition has not changed so much. And this actually led us to kind of the conclusion that in an environment that is fairly clean in spring, like the Arctic, that most of the particles, A, have a similar composition, and B, that also most of them can get activated as cloud condensation nuclei and then cloud droplets. There was colleagues of us who also looked at the importance of updraft velocity. I mentioned to you in the beginning that on the one hand, we need to know more about the particles, but then also updraft plays an important role in cloud formation. So they used a parameterization of cloud droplet formation to investigate the number and the properties of particles that would activate as cloud droplets at the same station. So we're still talking about this Arctic station. What you can see here is the particle number concentration measured at the station, and this is their predicted cloud droplet number concentration. And what they can show is that for the fall, when we have very low concentrations in the Arctic, that we are in an aerosol limited regime. So more aerosol particles would lead to more cloud droplets. Whereas, for example, in the spring and the summer, like late spring, late summer, there would also be a larger number of particles that would not be activated. So there would be an updraft limited regime, which shows that more particles would not lead to more cloud droplets. So this, on the one hand, confirms a little bit what we have seen, that often, like what the chemistry to some extent shows us, that in the Arctic, most of the particles can activate if we are in an aerosol limited regime, but also that updraft velocities actually then play a big role when it is about the number of cloud droplets that are being formed. Just to finish this topic also, I forgot that to mention here. So what we can see here, this line is the limiting cloud droplet number concentration. This would be that even if we increase more, like if we increase the number of particles, we would not get more cloud droplets. And our colleagues can show here that this limiting cloud droplet number concentration is a function of the updraft velocity, and they show that for many different places in the world. So, and it's the same also for Nyales. And so, like, it really depends on whether we are in an updraft limited or in an aerosol limited regimes for which particles get activated. If we are in an aerosol limited regime, then it is really possible that we can activate most of the particles, which we could also show with our chemical measurements in the Arctic. So to quickly summarize this part, so what we have learned from this study is that we have a strong influence of the local marine emissions on the cloud residual chemical composition in the summer, and that during the fall, when we have more pristine-like conditions, that clouds form over an aerosol-limited regime, also small particles get activated, but updraft velocity also plays an important role for this region. Now I would like to move to the more polluted measurement site in San Pietro Capiofiume in Italy. You see here a picture of the measurement site, the different containers with the different instruments. In one of those was also our mass spectrometer. And then I will also briefly touch upon that. We also had a fog water sampler. So we were collecting the fog water and then analyzing it with mass spectrometers. Interesting here to see also when we're talking about an air pollution cloud interaction perspective, this is a satellite picture of this Po Valley shown here, either covered in fog or then also by haze. So it really shows that depending on when we are measuring, in what season, that we are really influenced by either fog formation, or then we also see those big haze episodes. What is shown here is the instrumental setup. So in principle, it is very similar to what we had in the Arctic. So we had, again, this counterflow virtual impactor to look at the fog droplets now, not the cloud droplets, measuring with an aerosol mass spectrometer. We also took filter samples. We could switch that with a whole air inlet. And then this time, the Figaro SIMS, the one that we used in the Arctic, was not behind the CVI inlet. We could not realize that. So it was just measuring aerosol particles and gases. And then we also, as I mentioned, did fog water analysis. And you can see, talking about air pollution fog interaction, this one on the right is not a Coke. This is indeed a fog water sample, unfiltered. So if you sample fog water for a full fog event, the fog water is so polluted that it gets this terrible black color. This is a time series of what we measured of the different aerosol species, measured by aerosol mass spectrometer, organics, nitrate, sulfate, ammonium chloride, and then also black carbon. Then you see here the temperature and also the relative humidity. And in gray bars are those fog episodes. And interesting for us was to see, and I also want to focus your attention there, that we have these pollution episodes, so where nitrate organics are building up also here. And then we have these intermittent fog episodes, but they don't seem to change the pollution buildup, not at all. Like this is what we saw. We have a pollution buildup, but then we have the fog episode. Fog comes, dissipates, but it does not seem to influence the pollution buildup. We then looked at the difference in the composition of the particles when there's no fog to the fog residuals. This is shown here for the different species. And what we can see is that if we have fog, we have slightly more nitrate in the particle phase, which is also expected. So the inorganics with their high solubility, that they are higher in the fog than outside the fog. We did not only observe higher like nitrate, especially in the fog residuals, but also on the molecular level of the organics, more organic nitrogen. So what you see here are mass spectra. So again, each stick is an individual compound. For the gas phase, the particles that were not activated, the interstitial particles and the fog residuals. Focusing on the fog here, we see a high contribution of levoglucosan, this C6H10O5. So from biomass burning in both the gas phase and the interstitial particles, this also gets taken up by the fog. But then we also see those nitrogen-containing compounds that we see much less outside the fogs. Here, given the technique we used, those are like to some extent organonitrates. But when we are looking with the other technique, also directly measuring the fog residuals, what we can really see that overall the organic nitrogen is enhanced in fog. And this is shown here. So we have here the fraction of nitrogen containing compounds in the organics, the nitrogen to carbon ratio and the oxygen to carbon ratio. Focusing on this fraction of nitrogen, organic nitrogen, we see that it is enhanced in the fog residuals, in the fog water, compared to conditions before and after the fog, and overall when we don't have fog. So this is something that has also been observed, for example, in California, where there's also a lot of fog happening. And what it shows in a way, and coming now to a quick summary of this part, is that for nitrogen, like inorganic and organic nitrogen, fog episodes really play a role and can lead to changes in the chemistry. And this is, of course, very relevant when we think about this interaction of emissions from traffic or agriculture, and that they interact then with the fog and lead to these changes in the composition. But we still have a lot more to do in terms of analyzing these data. Good. I would like now to come to the last part of my talk and also kind of give a little bit of an outlook for what I think is interesting, and maybe also like a call for more collaboration. So I have shown you now like interactions of particles in a very pristine environment in the Arctic with like the potential influence on low-level clouds. We have looked at the polluted area, the interactions of aerosols, pollution with fog. And those were all measurements that were ground-based, which makes sense with the technique we use, that we are ground-based, we are sitting in one place, we check if we are impacted by clouds or fog, we do the measurements. Of course, like clouds happen higher up, especially if we are talking about convective clouds, which are a very important way of also transporting pollution up to higher altitudes. One can measure with aircraft and so on, but which makes everything more complex. But what I'm saying is that also this aspect of aerosol cloud interactions is extremely important to understand what is happening during the transport of convective clouds, like the transport of pollutants, of compounds up to higher altitudes where they can be transported further. And just to give you a snapshot of that, a few years back, we did measurements in South America at the highest atmospheric station in the world at 5,200 meters. And it sits on top of the Andes and is impacted both from like Amazon emissions and then the emissions from this altiplano. And what we could see there, directly observe, are compounds that were from the Amazon emitted from the biogenic emissions, then transported up through the convection, underwent oxidation, also formed new particles, were transported, and then we could measure them that far away at our station. So this is a little bit what I was talking about before. Like we have these convective systems that can bring up compounds from the boundary layer up in higher altitudes where they can get distributed further. And this is just to show you what we observed. So this shows where the air mass was coming from. Chacaltaya is where we were measuring. So when we were influenced by the air masses that had touched the boundary layer in the Amazon and then were impacting the station, we could see, apart from a change in ultrafine particle concentrations, low water vapor mixing ratio, so we were really impacted by more free tropospheric air, we could see this increase in C4-5 compounds, which were likely related to isoprene emissions from the Amazon. So isoprene C5 compound being transported up, oxidized, and then impacting the station. And this brings me now to kind of my final slide also. I mean, of course, Amazon is an important convective, like an important place where convection can happening, but this is also happening in other places of the world. And I think understanding more what kind of compounds are being transported up is very, very important, also for the distribution of pollutants and how they change with residence time in the atmosphere. And yeah, going a bit away from South America and then maybe coming a bit closer to where you are all. So this is a very recent paper that came out that is a collaboration with many Indian groups and our institute also, that looked at the air pollution sources in the Indo-Gangetic plain in many different stations based on filter measurements. And what they did is for PM 2.5 filters, like assessed the contribution of the different component sources. So we see again, nitrate, sulfate, ammonium chloride, elemental carbon, organic aerosol, so this big fraction for the warm and the cold months. and then doing source apportionment of the organic fraction and showing what the different contributions from different sources are. So a lot is related to biomass burning and fossil fuel burning. So this like a bit grayish would be hydrocarbon-like organics, so tailpipe emissions. We would have a high contribution of this cold season oxygenated organics, which is related to processed biomass smoke. Then here a bit the lighter blue oxygenated organic aerosol from urban emissions, a mix of traffic and biomass burning, and then also here more biomass burning. So really an important contribution are those combustion processes to the pollution that we see. It also has then implications for the health effect. So looking at the oxidative potential, we see that these traffic emissions have a high impact on health, but also this oxygenated and processed organic aerosol from the different combustion. And why I'm showing you this also is that it is, in my opinion, very interesting now that there is all this effect, all these efforts on reducing the air pollution sources also in such a big region like India, where so many people live, then to try to understand a little bit what is then the effect of this change in the atmospheric composition of a cleaner atmosphere on local and regional like cloud and haze properties. So what will that do to water uptake of aerosols? Maybe even through convection, what will it do to like monsoon? What are the interactions there? So I think this, in my opinion, is also a very important aspect to understand as we go about to become better in terms of air pollution. So to summarize again, and I have already shown you those messages, is that we have really, like, we understand better and better the aerosol particles. We can also use those techniques to maybe at the process level understand a bit better of what happens in terms of cloud formation. But what we then really need to do is to bring it to the big picture, to the regional and global model in collaboration with many different people so that we can really get a good and quantitative understanding of the different processes that are happening. And with that, I would like to thank all my colleagues and funding agencies, and then again you for the invitation, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much for such an interesting talk. I'm sure there'll be many questions. So I would request my colleague, Dr. Pandithurai, to take care of question answer session. Dr. Pandithurai?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Neeraj. And also I thank Professor Claudia Mohr for her excellent and informative talk. And she very nicely covered the chemical characteristics of aerosols and their role in cloud activation. And also she presented the cloud residual aerosols and their properties using advanced measurements over both over Arctic and different regions of world. So it's an excellent presentation, Professor Claudia. Now I invite participants to pose their questions. Already I see a few questions in the chat box. Whether the participants have access to mic, if so, I request now Anup Mahajan from IITM to pose his question. Anup, are you there?
Hi, Pandi. Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Claudia, very nice talk. It's very interesting to see the chemical composition changes and all. I had two questions. First was related to any iodine particle observations. Did you make any observations of HiO3 and did you detect it, especially in the Arctic?
That's a very good question. So I have to refer you for this to my collaborators who were also doing measurements in the Arctic. So the problem is with our methods that we use iodide as to ionize our molecules. So that totally makes it difficult for us to look at those species. So like if we wanted to focus on that, we would need to use like a different reagent ion and like basically add an additional instrument to that. But I'm sure you are aware of all the efforts that have been done there in terms of the importance for the iodine species for new particle formation. And I think it would be, I mean, my guess is that given that those species play such an important role in the very early stages of new particle formation, that they provide the seed then for the particles to grow through other species like the sulfur containing species and then end up as cloud condensation nuclei. So it's a very valid point that you make.
Yeah, no, because the reason, and that's my second question, which I was going to ask is, how much of a bias towards your conclusions is from your ability or inability to measure certain species? Because one of the things you showed was before, during, and after clouds, the composition doesn't really change. But is it the composition that you measure that doesn't change, or is it all the composition that doesn't change, or is it the sources which don't change? Can you actually identify that somehow?
Yes, I mean, you ask an excellent question. I think that's a very good point. It is a bit both. I mean, of course, I have not gone in much detail, but you are totally right. Like with our method, we are like measuring a certain subset of the total species, right? So like what we have focused on is really on the organic fraction. So we often combine it a bit with aerosol mass spectrometer measurements. That also gives us like nitrate sulfate. I have tried to show that as well. Also, like we would need other techniques to measure like offline analysis to measure the sea salt, for example. So what we focus on is really the organic fraction. And there, I would say if we compare to techniques that maybe measure total organic carbon, the AMS that is much more complete than us, we are somewhere on the range of 70 to 80% in the field measurements that we have done. So I think we are doing okay with giving like a large range of the organics with our technique. But of course, like if we're talking about the entire particle, like we need to have additional measurements.
And just one last comment, Pandi, if you don't mind, is about your observations for the fogs. That was very interesting data. I'm a bit surprised to see that you don't see a huge change in your nitrates and sulfates, which I would have expected, especially considering, the Hono production, etc.
Yes,
I'm very surprised at that.
I agree with you, and we're also still very early in this analysis there. I mean, for example, there have also been previous studies in the same region because it's a very well-studied region. They have shown that they observe really the processing of the biomass burning also in the aqueous phase. So we have to dig a bit deeper there. It could also be that like what we observed were like kind of fairly short fog episodes of a few hours maybe. We also think that the aerosol is largely regional. So it could also be that it has undergone already several fog cycles, has undergone some processing. And then when we measure just one single fog episode, that maybe the changes are not even that big anymore. You see what I mean? Because it has undergone several cycles already. In fact, this is also something that we have observed a bit in other regions. If you have this like cloud or fog cycles of a regional aerosol, that eventually you end up with this kind of processed soup that then maybe doesn't change so much anymore if you undergo like just one additional fog cycle, for example.
Yeah, some gas phase observations could complement that. That's all from my side.
Absolutely,
Thanks.
yes, which we also have, but have not looked at yet.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
So next I request Sunita Verma. Dr. Sunita Verma, you want to pose a question? Or I can read out your question. So her question is, are you there? Her question is, what are the typical mass to charge ratios observed for common aerosol component?
For what aerosol components?
For common aerosol.
For common, okay, yes. That's very hard to say. It depends a little bit where we measure. So I would say what we measure is we use iodide as reagent ion. So we always have this plus 127, subtracting that. Like say, if you are in a more natural environment, you are always around like 200 to 300, I would say. This is where we have the bulk, and then you have low contributions also when you are in the dimer region. So you could then double that. If you are in an urban environment, you would have potentially either a bit shorter chain compounds or then long chain compounds, hydrocarbons with lower oxygen numbers. So also that would put you somewhere in the 200 to 300 mass to charge ratio, if that like answers the question, hopefully.
Okay, the next question is from Professor Abhijit Chatterjee. Would you like to ask or shall I read out?
Yeah, he wrote that. You please read out.
Yeah.
He wrote.
His question is how the aerosol-cloud interaction depends on the aging of aerosols.
Yeah, that's a very excellent question as well. I think overall, what is happening that as aerosols spend time in the atmosphere with residence time, they get more oxidized. Often some molecules also fragments. So one can assume a little bit that, say, compared to a very freshly emitted aerosol, especially in urban areas, maybe with a lot of soot or dust, that overall it would increase a little bit in solubility and that it would become a more effective cloud condensation nucleus. Bit simplified.
Okay. The next question from Megha Anand is in slide 34. It is evident that the DCFH assay shows an effect solely due to OAA with no impact from HOA, which is a contrast to the DTT and AA assays where both OAA and HOA have an effect. Could you provide insight into why this difference might occur?
Yeah, I think there are colleagues that could talk much better in detail about these different acellular assays and the OP potential. I think those, because they look at slightly different compounds also, that we have a bit this range of results that we get, and that's why we also, like, people often use the different methods also to get a bit of idea of the range. So to really be able to well assess this OP.
Okay, another question from Archita Rana. Can we comment on the possible reaction pathway based on this SIMS data?
That's a very interesting question. Yes, we can. We can, depending on our previous knowledge. As I said, like with chemical ionization mass spectrometry or mass spectrometry in general, but like with SIMS, what we can get is at least like the molecular composition of compounds. So having that, like, can on the one hand facilitate like kind of the knowledge of what compounds we are forming, understanding reactions. On the other hand, fragmentation can sometimes also help because it can give us information on potential functional groups and so on. But people use it quite often to look into mechanisms as well. Say, for example, if we kind of know from which molecule we start from, we have maybe flow tube experiments or something like that with controlled conditions, we can get insights into mechanisms. People might also often combine it with theoretical approaches like quantum chemical efforts that can help additionally. So yes, it is a technique that is used also for mechanistic studies.
Yeah, there is another question. How do uncertainties in aerosol cloud interactions translate into uncertainties in climate predictions?
Yeah, I tried to show that a little bit in the beginning. I think, of course, like we have an overall warming effect that is overall dominated by CO2. But so when it comes to like political decisions or like efforts that we need to do as a society, I think there it is very important to really focus on the CO2. But I also think like for very accurate predictions, like understanding this small contribution on the order of 10% from the aerosols, and then maybe the lower percent of the aerosol cloud interactions are really important. And as I said in the beginning, trying to understand a bit better those processes, how to represent them in models will help us, like just being like having less uncertainties when it comes to our quantification, but it will for sure not influence the big picture that we have a warming effect of about +1 degree, and that is predominantly due to greenhouse gases.
There's a question from Yang Leon. What could be the role of marine bioaerosol over cloud particle activation?
Overall, the role of marine aerosols, like there we have to separate a little bit. So when we're talking about marine aerosols, of course, we have a very large fraction of sea salt that is part of that. And then together with the organics that are in the marine biosphere that are being emitted in sea spray, so this can lead to a very potent particle that can be very active as cloud condensation nucleus.
Meanwhile, I have one question. So you were showing the cloud residuals, the size distribution of cloud residual aerosols. So mainly it was showing the larger size spectrum. Is it that mainly influenced by the marine aerosols, or have you had any measurements other than the marine environment?
Yeah, that's a good question. So because we were focusing with our measurements on the smaller fraction, so we had measurements of up to 1 micrometer. Also with the size distribution measurements, we could really look at the Aitken and the accumulation mode mostly. And then when we are looking at the larger particles, which sea salt is in, so there is a bit of a submicron fraction also in sea salt, but it's mostly the larger particles. So those, they were not included in the data that I showed. We have also the analysis of the larger particles. So where we are going really above 1 micrometer. But then what we can see is that just their overall number concentration is lower, at least in our studies. So but we didn't analyze that for the cloud residuals.
There is a question from Deva Prasad. How did you measure cloud aerosol composition? Is it with the ground-based instrument? Can you comment on that?
Yes, so
inlight, right?
Yeah, exactly. So those are all ground-based measurements. So there is no aircraft measurements. So we are ground-based. So we have to go to places that are impacted by clouds. So that means we need to be on a mountain, for example, or in the case of the fog, because fog is close to the ground, that worked also just like without going to higher altitudes. And then we had this inlet that would separate the cloud particles from the non-activated particles. Exactly.
There is one more question from Ajit. How the NPFs and gas to particle conversion impact the aerosol cloud interaction?
So of course, like new particle formation is an extremely important source of atmospheric particles, and there are measurement studies. It is a study from a few years, modeling studies, measurements from a few years ago that estimate that about globally half of the particles that act as cloud condensation nuclei are from new particle formation. So it is potentially a very important source for particles and then also cloud condensation nuclei. And I think it is also a very important source because NPF is a process that has already happened in pre-industrial times with biogenic emissions, and understanding the pre-industrial composition processes are very relevant in order to understand now the anthropogenic perturbation.
It's a question from Anil. What would be the major chemical composition of marine bioaerosols?
The main chemical composition, the main chemical compound in marine bioaerosols. So if we are talking about the organic fraction, I'm not sure if the question goes in that direction. So if we are talking about the organic fraction, we have a lot of different species also. It's actually quite diverse. We have a big contribution of different acids, fatty acids. We also have like sugars being part of that. So it's a quite diverse means. It's quite a diverse range of compounds in the organic fraction of marine biogenic particles.
Okay. Yeah. One more question from Subrata. Did you check submicron aerosol composition by putting some cutoff inlet during fog or cloud events along with the GCVI in switching mode?
So we have the CVI and then the Hohler inlet and then the PM 2.5 inlet. So we have these three different inlets. For the PM1, we only rely on the aerosol mass spectrometer that has aerodynamic lens that only allows like particles smaller than 1 micrometer to go through. But we didn't have a specific PM1 inlet, no.
Okay.
Okay, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Just a second. Claudia, your lecture was so interesting that there are so many questions, but I hope you don't mind. Miss, can we ask a few more questions or miss?
That's totally fine, yes.
Okay, yeah. Please
Okay.
continue.
Yeah, this is a final
I
question.
mean, also, if people have questions, please send me emails. Like that's, I'm available by email all the time. I might not always reply very fast, but I'm definitely available by email for questions, or also more chats via Zoom or whatever.
Yeah. So I think there is one more question from Vijay. Can you please comment on the role of fog in formation of ROS active species? Can it enhance the oxidative potential of aerosols post-fog event?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question that we're also looking at right now. I think there are indications that this is happening. I would have to check the literature again, but now for our measurements, we have also taken filter samples that we want to use to investigate exactly that question. So this is a very good question. I think there is indications that this could actually lead to a higher oxidative potential, that we have the fog processing exactly.
Thank you, Professor Claudia. I think there are a lot of questions to you.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to get all these questions.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk and excellent interactions with the participants. So with this, I thank all the participants also to put a lot of questions to speaker. And also I want to thank all the ISTA executive committee members for organizing such an excellent talk from speaker. So with this, I'd like to conclude this seminar session. So with a big thanks to Professor Claudia Mohr. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So we can close it now.
Yes, Professor Neeraj, yeah, we can close, right?